Hello everyone, this is Gary Muir, your instructor. This video will discuss our next chapter in our cost course. It's chapter 6. This chapter begins on page, I should be ready with this, 200 and basically 74. The company profile in this particular chapter is the BP Petroleum, and it's a good example of a company that would use process costing. Process costing is used by those companies that make a lot of things, one kind. Georgia Pacific, they make a lot of toilet paper. So that's how we are going to present this material, in that mindset of making a lot of one thing. We're also going to show that we're going to accumulate costs instead of by job like we did in chapter 4. In chapter 6 we're going to present them, accumulate costs by department. So that's the big change here when we switch to this chapter. Now, just as a review of our due dates here, for chapter 6 we do have a requirement, since we're off next week. March 25th is the initial due date on the concept clips. We also have April 3rd for the homework assignments. All these again are due on by midnight of that particular date, and we're scheduled to do the exam on April 8th. So it's about three and a half weeks away for the exam. But remember, this chapter is a lot longer than the others. It will take some more time to get through all the homework assignments. In addition to the 25-point problem, which now becomes 40, the project has a Excel component to it. So if you look in Blackboard Shell and you go down to the now 50-point problem, which is problem 67, I've developed groups, 1 or 2 people in each group, that will basically do a Excel component to this assessment. Now the Excel component is the actual problem itself, problem 67, but done in 2 Excel worksheets. So your group will create these 2 worksheets, and I'll kind of go through that once we get through some of our problems on what type of information do we want on these worksheets. In addition, since we're doing a group project, there's a peer review that each member of the group will do on the other, as well as a self-review. And the big thing here, guys, is try to communicate. You'll notice that with your groups, and I'm just going to move this down a little bit, open this up. There is I hope I can see it. I must have to go up here. Sorry, guys. On the left side, there is a group button here that you could basically, between partners, do file exchanges. You can send emails between each other, and that allows you to communicate and keep going on the project problem itself. So that's our goal here, guys, is to do that process. You can also use Collaborate if you want to. Just come in and join the session, which is right here. And if you and your partner want to just join, just come on in and join, and basically that will open up your screen basically, and you have choices. You don't have to show or display yourself. You can just talk verbally, and it's not going to let me come in here, but basically you turn on the mic and then you can talk to the other person on the other end. If you don't wish to do that, there is a chat icon, and I'm afraid I can't show you that, but there's also a chat icon. You can type your questions between each other. So that's up to you. Again, the group icon here will also allow you to do that file exchange or send emails between each other if that's what you're more comfortable with. So getting back to our topic area here, Chapter 6 has the steps that we need to do. Oh, well, let's go back to our rubric. I really don't want to do this at this point. Let's wait on this. I need to go through a couple questions or a couple problems first here, just to introduce the chapter itself. Remember, we're doing process costing, a lot of similar products, similar things that we're making. Homogeneous means the same thing. And these are, again, our cost items will be accumulated by department now. And again, we have 3, and we're going to continue our applied overhead concept in Chapter 6 as well. The book does talk about sequential, and that basically means in a row, right? First department, second in a row. Parallel processing, just know a definition here. We're not going to actually do a parallel process type of costing system where 2 kind of merge, 2 are working on separate items and then merge into one. Think of a car when you're coming down an assembly line. You have the chassis being done on the left side, the motor being done on the right side, and eventually at some point they're completed and put together. That's what a parallel process is. And it just kind of goes through on pages 278, 279, the difference between job order and process costing. And remember that in process costing we're going to go accumulate costs by department. So that means we're going to have a separate WIP account for each department that we are watching our costs as we are producing our product. Now remember, with our 50-point problem for Chapter 6, there are going to be 2 departments. Hence, there will be 2 worksheets in one workbook that we'll have to do in Chapter 6's 50-point problem. And it just basically shows the flow of cost. Obviously, once the department work has been done in the first department, the total dollar amount comes over to the next department, and then from there the total goes into the final department in this case. And again, we'll be debiting the department called WIP, and we're going to be crediting the department that it comes out of, in this case, department mixing. So, very simple flow of cost, debits and credits. It's the accumulation of those costs that's going to be the difficult part. We switch terminology a little bit in Chapter 6. In Chapter 4, we called it a job order cost sheet. In Chapter 6, that turns into a production report by department. So a little different terminology, but same concept. We're going to accumulate costs on this production report, as well as units. So that's what's also new in Chapter 6. We're going to introduce a new terminology here. And you will look at the production report, and this is on page 281. Oh, I'm sorry, this is not in the book. But as you go through the chapter, the production report here is split into 2 halves. The top half is in units, and you'll see the word unit here. The bottom half have the cost information. Remember, with the production cycle being so large, so many units coming through it, it's very difficult, unless you track the units and costs with it, to come up with a cost per unit at the end of the particular month or whenever the part is complete. So we're tracking both on one report here. So our new term in Chapter 6 that we've not had before is called equivalent unit. And really the word equivalent means how complete are they, are the units that we're making. So we'll look at where our parts are in the production cycle. We'll ask personnel or the shop foreman how far they are in the production cycle. They'll say, well, we're about 50% complete. So we'll assign a equivalent unit to that one that we're making. So if it were 50% complete and we were looking at one unit, in terms of equivalent units, then it would be 0.5. So it's just a percent kind of translation of a whole unit, dependent upon the evaluation of how complete those units are. And they give a nice example in exercise, or example 2 here. Here we're looking at, we made 1,000, completed 1,000. We have 600 units partially done. The estimate is that they are 25% complete. So in terms of equivalent units then, that means 150. So the output that we've created in the month of October in this case is 1,150. So you'll see in many cases the equivalent unit number and then a whole unit number, which in this case is 1,600. So the whole unit term basically means that it is a unit, but we don't designate how complete they are. Just how many are we working on or completing at the same time. So we have to come up with a way of measuring this completeness. There's some ethical concerns here, so please read those. Because I could estimate higher or lower, and that can make the cost per unit change quite dramatically. So there is some pressure to make sure that this is fairly done and accurately done as well. Chapter 6, it does take longer to get through, and one of the reasons why is we're going to use 2 different ways to assign cost. One is the weighted average method, and the one is a FIFO method. Very similar to retail with when we talk about weighted average and FIFO. Similar terminology. Weighted average, we're combining costs from prior periods and current period and get a weighted average of that particular cost. FIFO method is we keep the layers separate, right? Last month's units are separate from this month's units. So there's advantages and disadvantages to that between these 2 methods. So in the book, again, please look at those differences. Make sure you understand which is a benefit, which one is a disadvantage for each of those kind of methods. So start out with weighted average. Again, it's a combination of cost, combines beginning cost with current period cost, hence the word weighted average. It's a much simpler method than the other one, the FIFO method. So weighted average is used quite often in practice, but FIFO has its advantages. It's more accurate. It can judge or determine a cost change rather quickly under the FIFO method. So I'm going to work through an example here to show the differences between the 2 methods as far as determining equivalent units. Remember, the goal with a production report is to show units as well as cost. So this is just a practice on how to do the upper half of the production report. unit section. So what I have here is basically our whole units starting out. We had 10,000 in the beginning. We started with 79,400. We started and completed 43, so I'm down here 400. Of that, 10,000 and in total 53,400 were completed and transferred out to the next department. For finished goods. If it's the last department, it might go to finished goods. So in other words, we're going to debit that next department WIP or finished goods inventory and credit this department's WIP for those costs being transferred out. What we have left is 36,000 ending units. You'll notice that in all cases, this number and this number have to equal. And the author will, in many cases, for example, tell us the ending units, which is 36,000. They'll tell us the completed units, which is 53,400. But they may not give us the started, and they give us the 10 for beginning units. We have to figure out one of the four. So you'll see that in problems, and the reason they do that is just to test your knowledge and understanding of how to get the other number. Now with weighted average method, the equivalent units, we always will have a subtotal called completed and ending WIP. The percent complete for completed units is always 100%. Completed units were 53.4, so 100% times 53.4. I'm just going to make this a multiplication, is 53.4 in equivalent units. And I'm going to abbreviate that EUQ. Now if we look at the percentage complete for this problem for the ending units, I don't think I mentioned it here, so let's jump to 45 in the book. These ending units are 60% complete. Times the 36,000 whole unit number, and in equivalent terms, it's 21.6 for the equivalent units. Now the equivalent units are just added together, which is 75,000. I carry my numbers over. And really, the 75,000 is our bottom number in our cost per unit computation. So that's our new denominator. In prior chapters, it was just units completed. Well, with production as it is, which never stops in many cases, we have to use equivalent units as our bottom number. So basically then it says, what is the unit manufacturing cost for June? We look at problem 45, their total cost, including the beginning. Remember, this is a weighted average method, is 174,000. We use our 75,000 EUQ, equivalent units, to come up with our cost per equivalent unit, which in this case is $2.32. I'm just going to put the designation down. So one of the questions that we'll always have is now that we know that the cost per equivalent unit is $2.32, what is the cost then transferred out to the next department for finished goods? Well, we're going to use that 232 and we're going to multiply by the completed units, which in this case was 53,400, which equals 123,888. The journal entry would be a debit to the next WIP department or finished goods and a credit for this department. Let's just put department B. The prior department was A for the 123,888. In addition, not only do we have to compute the cost of what was transferred out, we've got to compute the cost of what remains in this Department A's WIP account. So again, we're going to use that 232. We're going to multiply not by the 36,000, we're going to multiply by the 21,600 equivalent units. Remember that this here is a EU number. So is this number. You have to match apples with apples. So 232 times 21,600 gives me 50,012. And this is what remains in WIP. Department A, right? These were the units that didn't finish, that did not get fully complete. And you'll notice through the reconciliation, and the author will reconcile this, that we add these two together and we'll get 174,000. And remember, that was the cost that we started with. We just split it between what's left and what remains in this Department A, right? What left was 123,888. What remains is the $50,012, $112. So this is basically an informal production report, starting with the units, computing the equivalent units, coming up with a cost per equivalent unit, and then determine how much cost goes to the next department, how much cost remains in the department that we're in. Now, I did also use FIFO method for the same problem. We don't mix costs. So this is 45, exact same problem, same information. It's just that we're using the FIFO method. So what changes? So first we got to figure out in step basically 2, I guess they call it in the book, what is the FIFO equivalent unit? And here, instead of the completed units, we got to start with the started and completed units. The started and completed units in this particular case, and I do have a math error here, I just noticed that. So I got to take 53.4 minus 10, well obviously that would be 43.4. So I'm going to change this quick. Now we come up to this total 53.4. We're going to take the 43.4 and multiply by 100%, which obviously is 43.4 equivalent units. And with FIFO, we don't mix prior cost or units with current production. So we need to determine of the 10,000 beginning units, they were 80% done. So when the month started, these were 80% done. So that means to finish these units, right, required 20% more effort. So the next line I was going to put down is finished beginning WIP. Of the 10,000 units, whole units, to finish them required 20% more effort, which then leaves us with a 2,000 equivalent unit. And then our ending units, again, doesn't change. It was still 36,000, right? They were 60% done. So this now mirrors the weighted average method, comes up with 21.6. So if we add those together, we get $67,000 as our equivalent unit. So quite a bit of difference between weighted average. Under weighted average, the equivalent units were 75,000. Under FIFO method, they're only 67,000. But remember, that 67,000 represents just the production levels or output for this month. It does not mix a partial of those units from beginning inventory with our current production level. So to come up with the unit manufacturing costs now, since we have to keep our old cost and new cost separate, we only look at the current cost, which in this case is 124,000. So under FIFO, current cost only. And we're going to divide that current cost by the equivalent units that were produced this period of 67,000 in equivalent units. And we get $1.85. Not exactly perfect, there is some rounding here. Equivalent units of, I should put, I don't know why I put Q, EUP, EUP is the proper designation. Equivalent units of production. So, as we go on here then, we do the same steps. So we got step 2 done, which is come up with this equivalent unit. Step 3, the book says this is step 2, getting the equivalent unit. Coming up with the cost per equivalent unit is step 3. Step 4 then is to split the cost between what went out again, right, and what remains in ending WIP. So like our equivalent units, we always start with started and completed. Right? Started and completed. We had 43,400 equivalent units times our $1.85 equals $80,290. We had beginning WIP dollars of, in the book, 50,000. Because remember, FIFO means first in, first out. So if you think of a production cycle, those beginning units, those 10,000 units were finished first before we started and complete the 43.4. So just kind of think of the flow. And then remember, we had to finish those beginning WIP units. And the amount of effort that we used to finish that was 2,000, right? So 2,000 equivalent units of production times the $1.85 gives us $3,700. So in total, our total cost transferred out, I'm going to add the 50 to the 3,700 plus the 80,290 gives us 133,990 transferred out to the next department. And again, you would debit that department WIP account. You would credit this department's WIP account for that amount. Now to wrap up the split, right, that's what was transferred out. Our ending WIP, as far as what was done, was 21,600 equivalent units times $1.85 gives us $39,960. Basically what, 40,000? And you'll notice because I didn't quite have an exact two-place, because of rounding, I had to round that number. I don't quite come out to 174,000, but I do come out to 173,950. So $50 is off due to rounding. And we don't worry about that. We don't adjust or have to make an adjustment for that. In reality, if you were in real life, that $50 would be added to the cost of the material going out, right? And keep the what's left clean. Just because of size, you know what I mean. It's better to add a little more to the bigger number than a smaller number. It's just usually what we do. But don't worry about it for any of the problems. You could have rounding errors as high as $300, $400, $500 because of this rounding issue here. Depends on how bad it is when you get to that unit computation there. So that basically is a very basic difference in how we complete the weighted average versus the FIFO methods. I do have some good examples here. Remember, this process here is 5 sections. A physical flow, step 1 is where we look at those whole units and make sure we account for them, right? What's in beginning, what's in ending, what units are completed or how many are completed, how many did we start. And then when we get to step 2 is where we use our how much did we get done, you know, what's the equivalent units of production. Step 3 is the unit cost. Step 4 is the split between of that cost between what was transferred out as to the next department and then what remains, and then we do that reconciliation to make sure we didn't lose any dollars, right, as far as beginning WIP or some other number that we might have not reported correctly. So the book does those 5 steps. And I also just showed here some advantages and disadvantages. You can look at that on your own. I think I have to jump to page 292. Yes, page 292. So take a look at that, just so you get, again, an understanding. I would highly recommend reading this chapter. It, again, does a nice job showing the steps, showing the advantages and disadvantages. What I've done is I've completed some of these problems beforehand, just so you have a reference point. Let's jump to problem 49. And I didn't want to make these videos too long either. So if I jump to 49, it's a weighted average problem. You'll have to identify that component. when you get to the test or get to a problem, is it a weighted average problem or is it a FIFO problem? So you'll notice here I have the parts listed or steps listed here. And now the presentation of the production report. This is a formal production report. It's got the company name on it, it's got the department name on it, it's got the month or range, date range, so, and it's a weighted average method. And you'll notice here, I'm going to put this in, I guess, black. We have our step 1, which is whole units to account for. We've identified that we've got 60,000 units to account for. And of those units, we completed 50. We have 10 left in ending. We had 20 in the beginning, which we started 40, so they have to equal. Once we get past step 1, step 2 says, well, weighted average, I'm looking at the completed units. They're always 100% complete. Ending units, which there are 10,000 of them, are multiplied by the percent complete. The author tells us they're 20% done. Equivalent unit-wise, there are 2,000 units then with a total of 52. We get down to the cost section. The second half is the start of step 3, right? Step 3 here. We add beginning cost with current cost. We get 408,200. We divide the equivalent unit number into it, and our cost per equivalent unit, and that's the goal of step 3, is $7.85. Then in step 4, what I've done here is I've actually did the formulas down below, including the journal entry, because I will ask you, now that you have this production report, what's the journal entry going to be? In this case, to transfer out into another department this $392,500. It's a debit to that WIP, credit to the current WIP that we're in. And you'll notice in step 4, I'm taking the EOP number in both cases, both for the completed and ending WIP numbers, multiplying it by the equivalent units of production number of 785 to get the dollar amounts transferred out, to get the amount of cost remaining in that department. And that reconciliation process, we're going to compare the totals right here with this total up here. That is our reconciliation process. So again, just quickly going through those processes and steps so you got a kind of a feel as to how the flow works in a weighted average problem. If we switch gears here and do a FIFO problem, this was 55. Not enough information to do step 1, so I'm actually starting in step 2. They actually give us the equivalent units. It totaled 7,840. But remember, even though we have beginning cost under the FIFO method, we don't use it in our cost per equivalent unit. We only use current cost here to come up with our cost per unit. In this case, be careful with this on the test. I will give you beginning cost numbers for a FIFO method and ask you to do a cost per equivalent unit. Do not use the beginning cost. Only use the current cost in that number. And then I finish out in step 4. What was started and completed? 4,600 units. What was the cost of that? $1.79. Gives us the 8,234. Remember, with FIFO, I can't forget about the beginning cost. It'd be nice to, but we can't, right? That goes with the current cost that we've done this period. And in this case, we needed 840 units of equivalent work to complete those units at $1.79. So in reality, I transferred out a total of 10,858. What do I have left? 4,296 left in ending work in process for this department. So we are in the, it doesn't say what department we're in, but whatever this department is, that's what remains. Again, reconciliation, I'm off about $34 because, again, my cost per equivalent unit here is a rounded number. So you will see that in quite a few of your problems, and therefore the reconciliation isn't going to come out exact. Now, they do get more complex. Those are the easy ones. Multiple inputs at various degrees of completion and or multiple departments, right? So this non-uniform input is discussed starting on page 293. And this is where it gets, again, more complex. Non-uniform input means in my production cycle, certain things might be done right at the beginning. Let's say materials. I might add all my materials in this department right at the beginning. So they might, if I'm 10% done or 20% done with those units, as far as labor is concerned, I'm 100% done for material. That is considered a non-uniform input because my material and labor and hence overhead are not the same levels as I make my parts. This is probably more prevalent than the uniform input. So example 7 tries to show that non-uniform process here. You'll notice now with our ending units, look, they're already done for material. We're not going to add any more material. But they're only 40% done to labor and overhead. Sometimes these two together are called conversion, right? We learned this in chapter 2. Conversion, labor and overhead is only 40% done. Equivalent unit-wise, then you'll see that there's now a difference in EUPS between our material input and our conversion input. This is that non-uniform process here. And then obviously we have to calculate separate cost per equivalent units for each input then. And then add the two together to get a cost per equivalent unit. So it becomes a lot more complex, a lot more computation then to do the non-uniform input measurement. 51 is my example for this. It's a, what is this, a weighted average again. I make note here of its non-uniformability. And why is it non-uniform? Materials are added at the beginning. Look for that in your problems. It tells you whether the inputs are uniform or whether, in this case, materials are added at a different sequence than the conversion. Remember, conversion is the sum of labor and overhead. And we're going to use applied overhead. This is more or less an estimate of overhead based on an applied rate. Our completed units, the same, always 100%. And when we're doing our production reports, and I would like this in your group project also, is to have a percent column next to the input. So it's 100% for completed, it's 100% for completed conversion as well. That's always the case. When we get to the ending units, they were added at the beginning for material, but the conversion, they're only 60% done as far as labor and overhead. So 60% of 60,000, right, of our whole units in step 1 converts to an equivalent unit of 36,000. We then go down to our step 3 cost per equivalent unit. We take this equivalent units for each input, come up with a rate of 5 and $1.13. We add those two and get $6.13. And then that's what we use to finish out our particular problem. Now you'll notice for ending with now, I can't just have one number. I'm going to have two numbers, right? So for ending with, I got to take the materials, and equivalent-wise, I had 60,000 here. I'm going to multiply that 60,000 by 5, the cost per equivalent unit, and that gives me the 300,000 that I'm showing there. And for conversion, that was direct materials, right? The ending with conversion, there was equivalent unit-wise 36,000, right, in ending. I take the 36,000 times the conversion cost per equivalent unit of $1.13, and that gives me the 40,680. What remains then is 340,680. So if I were pricing this out, this particular unit or batch of whatever would be at $6.13. I would mark up my cost based on that, and basically that's the number that everybody looks at. What is my cost per unit, right? That's the goal of a cost accountant, is to come up with that number. So this is an example of a non-uniform input. 58 is another example, again weighted average. I make notes. I'm hoping they're pretty clear here, guys. Starting with step 1, we don't have to worry about uniform or not uniform. It's the same, right? It's 180,000. But in this particular example, I had to figure out the starting units, right? I didn't know it at this point. So you basically know that these two numbers, the counted numbers, have to match. So if I know the completed and ending WIP is 180, if the sum of those is 180, well then I know the upper part of the flow is also 180. My beginning units were 60. How do I get to 180? I have to subtract, right? So that's what we're looking here at. The numbers were kind of big, so I'm just going down here. Two material types, cabinets and components, and then finally conversion, which is direct labor and overhead. Normally we put those two together. It just saves having to do another column. And another reason we put those two together is that their percentages of completion are assumed to be the same in this case. So 150,000 were completed, 100%. Equivalent unit-wise, that's a 150. And then the ending units for cabinets and components are 100% because they're added at the beginning. At the beginning, both cabinets and components, those are our materials. And then it says my ending units for conversion, the shop supervisor says they're only 20% done for labor, which equates to 6,000 equivalent units. And then the rest is pretty straightforward from there. But realize again, with our ending units here, look at, we have now a cab, a component, and a conversion, right? So we have three different subcategories of ending WIP under this scenario. Going forward, I did the same problem using FIFO method, and this is probably the most difficult. We're changing gears. FIFO, the started and completed is what's used, which is 90,000. Where is that number coming from? Let's go back to the previous page. Realize of the 150, 60,000 were from beginning units. So that must mean under FIFO, my started and completed must be 90. So that's where that number is coming from. I had to back into it using our completed number of 150, subtracting out, well, that contains 60,000 beginning units from a prior month, gives us the 90 number. So 90,000 was started and completed, 100% always, right? Our beginning units were 60,000 units, but remember, last month we started those 60,000 units. They got 60% done, but for materials they were 100% done. So there was no effort needed to make or finish those beginning units as far as material is concerned, but I did need to do the complement of 60, or 40% more effort to finish those 60,000 units. So 40% times 60,000 beginning units gives us, obviously, the 24,000. Now I go to the ending units. Well, they were started, right? The material and cabinets and components were started 100% done, but for conversion, they're only 20% done. So my equivalent units are 120, 120, 120, purely by accident, guys. We got to the 120 just different ways, but that's just by accident. And then remember with FIFO, we don't include the beginning cost in our cost per equivalent number, but we still have to track it, right? We still have to keep it in our total, so that's why the 19,200,000 is there. And then I divide out, right, the equivalent, or the cost by the equivalent unit, and then come up with a cost per equivalent unit. And you'll notice under the weighted average method it was 90 for conversion. It's actually 72 under FIFO, and that must mean that our conversion, labor, and overhead must have came down quite a bit to get down to the 72. And that's one of the benefits with FIFO. You can see dramatically in the month that you're in that if the cost has changed or not. Whereas weighted average will kind of feather it out across multiple months. Transferred in is multiple departments. So on your project you will have, you'll have two departments. So on the second department you'll have a transferred in column. So transferred in is considered a material. I know it contains both material and conversion, but in reality it's treated like a material column. So take a look at that. Transferred in is basically discussed on pages 295 to the end of the chapter for the most part. So again, take a look at page 295 and forward, talks about transferred in. Example 8 is the transferred in example, so take a look at that. So I just listed that here. 65 and 66 is the example of a weighted average transferred in. Whether in Department A, it's uniform inputs. In Department B, it's not uniform. And the reason it's not uniform is that transferred in occurs right at the beginning of the production cycle. So I have a production cycle here. We're going from left to right. Our transferred in units hit right here at the start of the cycle. I can't start my production in the next department without those units, right? So therefore, they're 100% done for ending units when we look at the equivalent unit section. Also look at the purple numbers. 28,000 from Department A. Remember, that transferred out, which is 28,000, goes to the next department, right? That's the started units in the next department. The same is true of the cost. The cost that we're pulling out of this department A gets transferred to B in purple in the current row column, right? Transferred in comes from department A. This example, problem 65, is a great example for your 50-point problem. You'll have maybe a partner doing department A and the other department being done by the other partner. So take a look at it. Most students will do both so they get an understanding of these departments and how they work. Look in Excel. I'm looking, now this is part of the rubric, company name, production report, for the month of, those all should be in there. The unit information should be shown, and then the cost information in the second half of the worksheet. These templates are what I'm looking for from your group. And the ability to cell reference these numbers out of Department A and referenced into Department B. The purple numbers should be cell referenced. There will also be rounding requirements, and the rounding requirements follow the group projects problem. It'll tell you in C now. Some units will be rounded to 2 places, some will be rounded to 4 places. So take a look at these examples, kind of get the flow again of how these worksheets work. We got to start with step 1, units to account for, right? Whole units. Step 2, we convert those whole units to equivalent units, and we come up with an EOP number of 36,000, 34,500, and 34,500 for conversion. Step 3, we come up with a cost per equivalent unit, taking our total cost divided by step 2's number to get a unit cost of 572, $1.10, 420. The total of those 3 now, right, should be 11.02. So even on your Excel project, guys, I want formulas in the totals, right? Even the subtotals. Follow ledger rules. If you had me for ledger, if there is a subtotal, make sure there's an underline above the subtotal and a double underline to end that subtotal. Follow these worksheets and you'll have the rubric basically done. It's up to you how you want to show the computations in the cell. Again, I would like these, you'll notice that these are whole numbers. I want these formulas round to 0 places. I know that will create more of a discrepancy on a reconciliation, but it's small dollars, right? Small peanuts. And again, it makes it look more clean. So again, we'll review the rubric before we leave here. And I'm just carrying it forward to show the computations. I show how I get that computation. This happens to be the Department A FIFO method now. You'll be responsible for both methods, weighted average and FIFO, obviously. You'll notice on Department A how the start and complete is used, and to finish beginning units is used under the FIFO method. So those are the 2 areas that are really different under the FIFO method. Also realize this is a uniform input on the first department. It's a non-uniform input on the second department. So I'm using the same percentages, 60 for beginning to finish them, right? They were 40% done, which then leads to the 60% to finish those, right, units. So 60% of 5,000 is 3,000. Under FIFO method, we don't mix current with prior cost. So I just put X's there, don't include them, but we still have to track it, right? The 16,900 cannot just disappear. So that's included just in the total column. Here we come up with 554 and then finally finish those rates out on the bottom. So started and completed to finish those units, and then don't forget we have to account for the beginning dollars of those units or cost transferring out. Ending units, same process. What is the equivalent unit? 1,600 in both cases because it's uniform, and we multiply them by the rates, and that's what remains in this ending WIP account. If I go to Department B, again, not uniform because of the transferred in. So look for that information. Those are zeros on those numbers. The rest was uniform material and conversion in the current period. But here again, started and completed to finish those beginning units. And then ending units are 100% done for transferred in because we're not going to do anymore, right? It's fully complete, as opposed to the other ones, the 50 and the 50. You'll notice too there's a little more work on the transferred out number. We have to designate each department, right? Transferred in, material, conversion on the cost transferred out, just like we did for the ending WIP, transferred in, direct material conversion. So FIFO, it's more accurate because we're accounting for each cost category separately, and we're only including current cost in that computation, but it's a lot more work, guys. So kind of, again, that's why we have this 2-3 week time period to complete Chapter 6. That was basically all I was going to show you in part for this. The FIFO detail is discussed in the appendix, so we are covering the appendix. This begins on page 298 of our textbook, so we are completing that. Again, use the chapters. I think they do a very nice job explaining it. There's some good how-to videos out on Cengage CNOW, so take a look at those. Hopefully in combination with all that help, and if you need some help, let me know immediately if you're struggling with any of this topic area or trying to get the answers correct in CMO. Let me know what you're doing, guys, and how you're doing. I do want to go back to the rubric just to be sure that your group knows what to do. You will submit just one workbook per group. In that workbook, you'll have 2 worksheets, a mixing department and an encapsulating. For problem 67, it begins or is on page 327 of our book. We are doing the weighted average method, so that's good. It's a little simpler. The problem is a little more complex because the mixing department is in gallons, and the pills, the second department, is in, or the encapsulating department is in pills. So there is a conversion that will be necessary, and I talk about that conversion here. For every gallon of mix, the pills that we can get from that gallon is 1,500 pills. So when we talk about the units started in the encapsulating, you're going to have a formula in there, cell referencing the gallons transferred out of the mix times 1,500 to give you capsules in the encapsulating department for the started units. So that's the only quirky thing with problem 67 is that conversion for the units only, right? So your departments, one will be in gallons, the units will be in gallons, the encapsulating will be in number of pills. So in the mixing, make sure, and the encapsulating, make sure in step 2 that you add a percentage column, because I want a formula taking the percent times step 1's number to get the equivalent number. In step 3 then, there's some rounding in your formula. For the mixing, I want you to round to 2 places the cost per equivalent unit in the mixing department. That number turns to 4 places, round to 4 places in the encapsulating department for that cost per equivalent unit. Then in step 4, I want you to use step 2's equivalent number times the step 3's cost per equivalent number, but then round to 0 places that number. The reason I'm doing the rounding the way I'm doing it is that's how Cengage wants the answers. So what you're doing on an Excel spreadsheet for both departments is what you're going to enter into Cengage's CNOW. So you are going to be able to verify your answers. You got 3 check my works. Your partner has 3 check my works. You'll have 6 check my works in total to verify the answers. Also be aware with the applied overhead. Remember, you're going to have direct materials for a cost category and conversion for a cost category. Well, conversion consists of direct labor plus applied overhead. I know they're listed separately on the problem, but combine them, right, into one number called conversion. Use example 65, guys. That's your key as how to lay out this spreadsheet. Now the mixing department will take the direct labor cost and the markup, the applied rate is 200% of the direct labor cost. This is discussed on page 328 of your problem. So in mixing, 200%. So you'll notice on page 327, the author doesn't give you the overhead amount. It's a question mark. Well, you got to take the labor times 200% to get the overhead, right? Both just in the mixing. If you're in encapsulating, you got to take the labor times 150% to get the applied overhead. So hopefully that makes sense. Let me know if you have any concerns. Now I also showed in CNOW the layout of the problem is similar to the book. I talk about the 200. I talk about the 150 conversion and how to get the question mark computed. I also mentioned that this started units in the encapsulating department has to be multiplied by the 1,500 capsules to convert gallons to capsules. But also know the production report in CNOW is different than what you're doing on your Excel spreadsheet if you're following example exercise 65. You'll notice that the physical step 1 section is found here in 2 parts. Remember, these 2 numbers have to match. The equivalent step 2 section is this little itty-bitty column called equivalent units. That's it. That's all there is for step 2. There is no percentage column, so you're just going to take your Excel spreadsheet and put the equivalent unit number in there. Then it's pretty similar going forward after that. You'll have your cost information where you'll accumulate your cost per equivalent unit. You notice here though that they did not come up with a cost individually because this is a uniform department. So you can just have the one cost per equivalent unit number here. It changes though when you get to the encapsulating, because there it is not uniform. So each cost category will have its own cost per equivalent unit. So give it a try. Let me know how you're progressing as you're doing the homework, or doing the exercises, doing the problems. Let me know how you and your group are doing. Probably the biggest obstacle, because so many of you are so busy, is allowing time to communicate with each other. If a student emails you about the project, don't leave them hanging. Respond as soon as you can and let them know where you're at, what you're doing, what you're planning, what you're thinking, and then basically this is the only time on a TSA, this is a TSA component to the course, this is the only time that you can have a partner on a TSA project. So let me know, keep me posted, and good luck, guys.